In this video, we get to take these unfinished ends and turn them into this finished bench.
The past, it is written in stone.
So this will be the final build video in the Bluestone bench series. Take time to check out the other build videos. There was one on making full-size drawings for the bench. There was one on making the bent laminated stretchers. There's another video on doing the stack laminated ends and chip carving them. And then this video is the finishing up of the Bluestone bench. It is an exciting one to do because it takes an unfinished project and it makes it into a finished product. But before we can get to there, we need to be able to sand these ends. Side one. This is a fairly tedious process because there are a lot of chips that we chip carved into there, but each one of those needs to be sanded, not just once, but twice. Side two. So it needs to be sanded, and then after we raise the grain, it'll need to be sanded again. There was over 8 hours of sanding that needed to happen to these before they were ready to go into the spray booth. But what needs to be done, needs to be done. Side three. All of the ridges that are created by the chips that are in there need to be sanded off. First thing I do is I go over the entire surface with 120 grit sandpaper. That's side four, under the edges. And then I go back in and I sand the individual chips with 180 grit sandpaper. When you sand over the ridges, you kind of create flat spots on the top. And part of the process of sanding the actual chip areas is to blend that in. You get a really nice effect though. It is almost like rippling water and it looks really, really nice. Well, with that, I am done with the sanding on these two things. It is time to start putting the finish on. Let's go do that. Well, the next step was to get some color on the ends, and I started out with doing some samples. This is a reminder to us that anytime you change anything up about your finishing process, it is good to do samples, because I did not like what I saw. As a matter of fact, the top coat and the milk paint crackled when they were applied to each other. In general, it was just a very dull and unappealing look, and so I abandoned the black milk paint and I instead went with something different. The old-fashioned milk paint company puts out a base no-pigment option. It's meant so you can add your own color and create custom colors, but I use it as something to actually darken cherry. The lye in the milk paint base actually reacts with the tannins in the cherry, and you end up with an amazing rich red color. The first step before applying the color is to raise the grain. Milk paint is a powder that you add water to, and that water actually raises the grain when you put it on there, and so it is always best to raise that grain first and then sand it down. Raising the grain is a very simple process of just flooding the surface with water and then letting it dry and then sanding it down again. So once that dried, I was able to sand it down. It was pretty much the same process as sanding the first time, except that I used 280 grit sandpaper, but still each one of those chip carvings needed to be sanded out, so it was kind of tedious, especially the second time around. Again, the coloring was put on by taking the old-fashioned milk paint company's base no-pigment paint and mixing it. I mix it a little bit thin, probably 3 times the amount of water that they recommend for the actual milk paint process, and then it's put on with a brush. It takes a little bit of work to get this onto all sides, and it needs to be fairly wet. I left it for about 10 minutes after I finished the first coat on all of it, and in that time I went back around and I hit everything again to make sure things were wet. But the process of coloring actually happens really quick. So there are a few precautions that you need to take when working with milk paint, and that is to protect your skin and to protect your eyes. That is because the chemical process that is actually darkening the wood involves the lye that is a part of milk paint, and lye is a fairly caustic chemical, and so care needs to be taken when you are working with it. After that was left to sit for about 10 minutes, I was able to go back over it with a sponge and water. This process took a while. I had to go over it I think 4 times. I probably switched out the water somewhere close to 6 times just to make sure that we was cleaning it with clean water over and over again, wringing out the sponge continuously, wiping a little bit, wringing it out. I was also able to go at it with a toothbrush, and that was able to get into some of the cracks and crevices that were created when the chip carving happened. There was a little bit of tear out, and the milk paint kind of was hanging out down in those, and I was able to get that out with the toothbrush, but I was able to get that out fairly well. After everything was cleaned up, I was able to let that set for a couple days before we put the top coat on it. So I wanted to put a little before and after of what exactly the milk paint does to the wood when you use the milk paint that is the base paint with no dye. With cherry anyways, it is an amazing transformation that happens. And again, this transformation happened in the first 5 to 10 minutes that the milk paint was on the wood. Most of the rest of the time was spent cleaning up. That probably took 45 minutes. The actual transformation happens fairly quickly. Next step was getting the ends into the spray booth so we could get the finish on the ends so that when I glue it up, I won't have to worry about the cleanup with the glue, and I'll have a really clean line between the stretchers, which are very light maple, and these dark cherry ends. Started off this with a spray gun in my hand and a tack cloth, making sure everything was clean, and then I started spraying. I am using Campbell's Crystal. It is a water white, non-yellowing conversion varnish. It is post-catalyzed, meaning that I have to add the catalyst in the workshop, but it is a very durable finish. I've been using it for many years. So you see me putting 2 coats on it in the video, but I actually put 4 or 5 coats on. I wanted it to be really well sealed so that I went through and did a very light sanding on it. I didn't have to worry about wearing through any of the high spots of the chip carving into the wood itself. So you notice as I'm spraying here that the inside of the mortises on each end of the bench are covered in blue, and that is just some blue tape. I needed that to be masked off during the finishing process so that it didn't seal the end, because that is my glue surface when I glue the bench up in the next step. So let that finish dry overnight, and then I did a dry fit of everything, getting the stretchers through the ends and having everything positioned just the way I wanted it. And then I pulled one end off and I glued it together. You'll notice there in the middle of the stretchers there's a bunch of wood stacked up. That's actually to hold the stretchers up in place so that when I pulled the ends off, they were in the right height and they didn't fall down. I didn't have to worry about they were just being held there in place perfectly. I'm using Titebond 3 wood glue. I'm doing that not because it's waterproof, it doesn't matter for this. I'm doing that because it has a longer open time. I wanted to make sure I had no problem sliding the ends onto the stretchers before the glue tacked up. That does, however, mean that I need to be extremely careful with the cleanup to make sure that I get all of the glue off, because you only get Titebond 3 glue off after it's dried by sanding it off or scraping it off. And so I was extra careful getting it off not only the stretchers, but also off of the ends that have already been finished, which of course was much easier because they were finished. One note, the stretchers are actually through tenons. You see them through the other side, but you have to make sure that you put glue on that entire tenon that is being pushed through, because otherwise it'll simply scrape all of the glue off of the inside of the mortise as you're pushing it through, and it's going to give you a higher chance of having a dry joint in there. And so you want to make sure that you put glue on the entire tenon, not just on the portion that's going to end up being glued up in the mortise. Once the first end was dry, I simply repeated the process on the other end, and we had a finished glued up bench ready to move to the next step. I picked up the Bluestone seats from Bosket Brothers Bluestone, located near Deposit, New York. It was an amazing tour, and I actually did a full-length video of the shop tour and me picking up the stone. I encourage you to check that out. There will be a link in the description as well as a card here on the screen. So with the Bluestone seats in hand, I then needed to attach them to the bench. Each of the seats is held in by 4 5-inch lag bolts that are 3/8 inch in diameter. Those go into some 3/8 inch brass inserts that I put into the seat tops. So the first thing to do was to drill the holes through the stretchers. There is a countersink hole for the washer and the head of the bolt on the underside of that. I just freehanded that with a drill and a 1-inch Forstner drill bit. I then made a jig out of a piece of cherry that would guide the 7/16 drill bit that I used to drill the rest of the way through the stretchers with. And I clamped that onto the board in the right place, and I used that to guide the drill bit so that it went straight through the stretchers. It works very well to do this when you have a piece that is too big to take over to your drill press. So this is a large piece. It is 7 foot long, and this is the last time I'm able to move this on my own, because as soon as the Bluestone bench gets the seats on it, it's very heavy, close to 200 pounds at that point. I did the final assembly of the seats on the ground, and after that, the rest of the time in the workshop, it spent its life on dollies so that I could actually move it around. The next step was to position the 3 seats onto the bench and get them exactly where I wanted them so that I could mark out the holes in the stretchers on the bottom side of the seats to prepare for the drilling of the holes for the inserts. I used a center punch up through the holes. There was a 64th underside, so it would easily go up in and out of the hole, and I could just tap it a couple times with a hammer, and it left a nice little mark on the bottom of the seat that allowed me to position the inserts precisely. With the locations for the inserts on the bottom of the seats, I then went to drilling the holes for the inserts. I started out with a 3/16 pilot hole to accurately locate the hole, and then I followed that with a 1/2-inch bit. These are drilled with a hammer drill, and the only thing I really needed to be careful with is making sure that I did not go through the thickness of the seat and come out on the other side. The 3/8 inch brass inserts that I'm using on the bottom of the seats were actually meant for wood, and so I ground off much of the thread that would have been used to hold it into the wood. This allowed it to fit into the 1/2-inch hole, and of course this is being held in with epoxy, not with the threads, and so the threads are somewhat irrelevant here. Once I had the inserts ground down so they would fit into the holes snugly, but they would go in easily, I mixed up some epoxy. I was then able to put the epoxy on the inside of the hole and the outside of the insert and place it in. I'm actually using that 3/8 inch bolt to lower it in and then position it. I needed to take care to make sure that I did not get any of the epoxy on the threads. And finally, I was able to use a rod of steel that fit nicely down into the threads that allowed me to straighten up each one of the inserts to make sure that they were true 90 degrees to the surface of the seat. Then it was back into the spray booth to put the finish on the stretchers, as well as a couple more coats of finish on the ends. And finally, we're on to the final attachment of the seats to the bench. I had placed the bench onto the floor on a couple of dollies at this point so that I am able to move it around. The long brass bolts you see there are just simply so that I can get them up into the inserts and position the seat easily, and then I go back behind and I put the 5-inch bolts in that actually hold the seats onto the bench. Working this close to the floor meant I either needed to bend over or work blindly, and I chose to work blindly. It was not actually that difficult determining where the holes are with my fingers and getting everything in position. I simply hand tighten the bolts rather than wrenching down on them. I didn't want to take any chance of pulling the inserts out of the seats.
Well, that's it. With that, all 3 seats are on the Bluestone bench, and I think we have a finished bench.
And just like that, another project has come to an end. Let me give a special thank you to the boys at Bosket Brother Bluestone, Mo, Andrew, and Josh for providing the Bluestone for this bench. Thank you also to my wife, my wonderful wife, for all the support that she gives me, and thank you to you for watching. This is Todd Wolfe with Made by Wolfe, encouraging you to get out in your space and make something today.
The past, it is written in stone.